Good morning, everybody. We'll get started in just a minute or two. All right, it's 9:30. This is a meeting of the Municipality of Anchorage Assembly Reapportionment Committee for October 27th, scheduled from 9:30 to 10:30. Madam Clerk, would you please take the roll?
Yes. Mr. Constant?
Here.
Ms. Kennedy?
Here.
Mr. Peterson?
Present.
Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Ms. Quinn Davidson is excused today.
Okay. And then for other assembly members, Ms. Allard?
Here.
Mr. Dunbar? Ms. LaFrance? Mr. Perez-Verdia? Mr. Rivera? Mr. Weddleton? Ms. Zelatel? Thank you, Chair.
All right, thank you very much. So this morning on the agenda, we have 3 items for new business. One is an introduction of the contractor, RDI. One is a discussion of timelines, and one is communications plan. And then we will have a conversation about, or excuse me, we'll hear from the public after that. So I would like to take a moment to introduce the folks from RDI. And I don't know if it's going to be Diane or Dennis who's going to take the lead.
It will be me, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Wheeler, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, my name is Dennis Wheeler. I am with Resource Data. Resource Data is a homegrown company. We're about 185 strong. We've been in Anchorage for well over 30 years and have over 90 staff associated with the corporate and branch office here in Anchorage. We also have offices in Houston, Portland, Juneau, and Boise. And we do a broad range of IT related projects, not only in terms of developing custom software, but helping clients such as the Municipality of Anchorage with these kinds of projects where there's a heavy lift in terms of the technical needs to support the project goals, in this case, the discussion and ultimate resolution of reapportionment. And to that extent, we have worked on reapportionment issues before and are currently working with the state of Idaho on their reapportionment project, as well as now looking to support the municipality on its project. So I personally, as many of you may know, have experience working in the municipal attorney's office, and as such have worked on a couple of different reapportionment issues in 2000 and 2010. And so this is my third, and I get to relearn it all over again. So I'm excited about that on a personal level. The staff that we have working on reapportionment have supported, as I mentioned, Idaho, but also have past experience helping the state of Alaska with its reapportionment. So we currently have myself and 3 other team members assigned to this project, including Ashley Reiser, Senior Project Manager with a high degree of technical skill in GIS. We have Alex Hutchinson in GIS and Laurel Warner in GIS. So we're all local and prepared to support this project. Mr. Chairman, that's the intro in terms of who Resource Data is. I know we wanted to talk a little bit about history and timeline, but I'll defer back to you on how and when you do that within the meeting.
Thank you, Dennis. Mr. Wheeler, is there any member of the committee who has any questions at the beginning here? So I'm not seeing anyone with questions. Dennis, why don't you go ahead and dive in with a little historic presentation? And I think you have a slide deck for that.
I do. I can screen share if that's easiest.
Yeah, that would be great, or the clerk can. And for members of the public who are tuning in by phone, you can go to the committee website. It's www.muni.org/assembly. Go to the committee link and then open the reapportionment committee. The slide and materials for this meeting are there. Go ahead, Mr. Wheeler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Committee members, this presentation is really a plagiarism of the good work that the Assembly Council's office has already done and presented in prior meetings and submitted to the committee agenda of September 30. I just combined two of the presentation materials, and there's some definite heavy detail in here, and I'll try not to get too far into the weeds on the heavy detail. Really, I want to just kind of skim over the top of this to give a general sense, and then we get into the heavy detail once we start actually doing the hard work of creating the districts themselves. But with that said, as let me make sure I click on the right thing here. There we go. All right. So as many of you may know, Anchorage as a city and borough unified in '75, and as part of that had to create the first maps of how to create the assembly districts. This is a representation of some of the things they looked at back then. And then now the current 2012 districts, as you're most familiar with here. One quick note here on deviation. Deviation is a term you're going to hear a lot. You're going to try to minimize deviation as much as possible to meet legal standards. And to explain deviation, I think it's important to look at the table at the upper left here of this map, and you'll see percentages. The deviation is really taking the most negative, if you will, deviation and adding it to the most positive to get the range of deviation overall. So keep that in mind. It's not just looking at, oh, well, we're only a deviation of at the high end of 0.58%. It's really the spread between, say, for example, negative 1.47 and the upper end of 0.58 or whatever that number is right there. So that's deviation. I'm going to touch on that. Here's the charter section that you may be familiar with. Obviously, you reapportion whenever you've made the determination that you are malapportioned. And you're going to declare that by resolution within 2 months from the state's adoption of its final plan. If the state stays on schedule and adopts on November 10, 2 months from then, you'll have to have made your determination. How do you calculate the 2 months? Well, there might be two different opinions on that. Is that 60 days, or do you just count calendar and go, okay, 2 months from November 10 must be January 10 or maybe January 11 if you don't count the first day. So we'll talk about that when we talk timeline. Once you've made that declaration and if you determine you are malapportioned, you've got 6 months. Whoops, back up. You've got 6 months to then make that reapportionment decision and adopt the new map. I'm going to pause it for just a second in case there's any questions.
I am not yet seeing any.
All right. All right, the Alaska Constitution, I'm not going to spend any time there. It's pretty straightforward in terms of what the state board has to do. What we're really looking for is the end result from that. We'll skip through these. All right, so here's a sample of the resolution declaring yourself malapportioned. This is from 2012, and it contains some pretty straightforward language regarding reference to the Census Bureau information that you're going to be referring to. So we would prepare a draft resolution and run that through your various internal review processes to get that done. And then when it comes time to actually adopt the maps, there's some sampling of the various titles that have been used and discussed in terms of an ordinance actually adopting the new map. Okay, malapportionment. This is going to get down in the legal weeds, and I don't think I want to spend a whole lot of time here, but obviously one thing to keep in mind is that if you're greater than 10% from your lowest population to your highest population, you are presumptively malapportioned. So that's certainly something to keep in mind as we go through this process. Here are some criteria. Note that divide by 11 is actually going to be a little different this time around. And that's the steps you were going to walk through for your deviation. Okay, and this is a sample of prior findings on malapportionment. You can see the deviations in these tables. If you look at this one on the lower left, you can see the target populations and the deviation ranges. And remember, as I mentioned earlier, you take the greatest spread between the lowest and highest to look at your deviation numbers. I won't spend time on the anomalies here. We'll address them if they become an issue. All right, now what are you looking for when you actually get to draw the lines? Well, obviously it's the population is an issue, but also you're looking at the charter call that these districts be compact, contiguous, and relatively integrated, keeping in mind that there's a state decision that says Anchorage generally is considered relatively integrated and doesn't have some of the variations you might see in other cities or other locations, even within the state. This is another sample of the deviation ranges. And this shows you how it's calculated if you need to see that more formally. Another thing to keep in mind is the Voting Rights Act and the impact of how you draw the districts on minority populations. I know that you may have seen an email last night from a member of the public regarding a Supreme Court case. I won't spend time discussing the legal issues in that case, as I am not hired to do the legal work for the committee. But if we need to discuss that today, Mr. Chairman, I think I can at least provide my quick take on it, but perhaps Dean or another representative of the community that's here can also touch on that if we need to. But obviously it's one of those things we need to pay attention to. And here's some sampling of the kind of data analysis that is done when you're looking at the potential impacts on minority populations within your districts. And this is the reference I made earlier to the Anchorage case regarding that Anchorage is in fact considered socioeconomically integrated, which gives you some flexibility in terms of drawing lines that other jurisdictions may not have. I'm going to skip over this. We can refer to it later if need be. All right, and I know that in prior meetings you've talked about truncation of terms. Again, this is available to people as a resource, but we won't be spending time on it here, as this is not an area that I'll be providing or we'll be providing assistance on.
And Dennis, I'll just add in, that's because, again, RDI is not hired to do legal analysis for us. We have internal legal for that.
Exactly. Okay, and so this is a reference to the prop on expanding to the 12-member 6 district model. Again, just for reference. The state timeline, presuming November 10 as the election date. Now I need to change this, or sorry, the adoption date. Whoops, let me back up. The original slide that I submitted a couple of days ago had December in here instead of November 10. So this February 28 date will need to slide back into January, early January, and we'll talk about that when we talk about timeline. That is a speedy overview, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And I would just note, for the purposes of that timeline, those are, once we get it exactly correct, the far end of time, not the target. As often is said in these meetings, that's a ceiling and not a target. The committee members have expressed to me interest in, let's do this thoroughly and with all due haste. So, okay, that is the initial kind of framework for folks. Are there any questions from members of the committee or the assembly? Not currently seeing any right now. The question of the Voting Rights Act, we can have a conversation about that. Probably not now. I think I would like to give our legal team time to contemplate the question, to come up with a response and not have to riff off the cuff. And so, but with that said, it's certainly an item that I've now added to the agenda, Mandy, for a discussion at a future meeting. So next on the agenda, we have the timeline discussion. And Dennis, are you prepared for this one too?
I am, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to share my screen again.
Yep, you have the floor.
So this is a very draft timeline. What I've outlined here is the critical steps, mostly centered around what your meeting schedule might look like. And I've added a couple of risk factors at the bottom that should be pretty obvious in terms of number 2, which is the committee and assembly schedules. But number 1 also is the acquisition and stand up of the GIS tools to actually utilizing the mapping features and digest and produce maps for the committee. We'll need to make some decisions on that, Mr. Chairman, offline here pretty quickly. But once we get that going, then I've got a schedule outlined here that theoretically could accomplish reapportionment in February as suggested as a tentative starting point for discussion.
Great. And so in the context of the previous discussion, that is essentially a pretty robust and aggressive timeline right there, maybe as quickly as we can possibly do it without cutting any corners and meeting all the standards we need to. And then August or July would be the kind of far end of that timeline. Members of the committee, any interest and input for this? Put yourself in the chat or just speak up at this point. Other members of the assembly?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And of course, this timeline, there many times are court cases filed in redistricting. So sometimes the timeline can change depending on what's happening with lawsuits and that type of thing. Hopefully that won't be the case this time, but you never know. Thanks.
Right, and I believe, and Dean may be able to clarify for me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the state law puts a 30-day kind of end on the potential for litigation. And so you can add 30 days to the day we adopt the final plan for legal challenges, and then there can be legal questions that arise from that that might take some more time, but the courts fast track these questions because of their nature. Dean, did I get any of that wrong?
I'm not quite sure about that, but I can be back later.
Okay, thank you. And we can also set that on as another agenda item for the next meeting, which would be legal challenges, kind of the methods and just a discussion about how that would and could work or the history of it. So that is the preliminary proposed timeline. We don't have the meeting dates tagged in there yet, but the committee, Mandy, do you know what the committee dates are for November and December?
We haven't set any up past today. We've kind of been going off of waiting for this presentation, I believe, and getting more information from Mr. Wheeler. So it might be a good discussion to have today with the committee about getting a reoccurring meeting set up.
I think that we made that decision at the last meeting, and that's going to be the alternating Thursday at 9:30 of the CEDC meeting. Ms. Kennedy?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. You know, I just wanted to mention that I think we need to be cognizant of the holiday period. We'll definitely have issues with trying to have town hall meetings and things during, I would say, any time after between Thanksgiving and New Year's Eve. So I just want to make sure that we don't try to push anything too heavily during those time periods. Committee meetings won't be such a big deal, but I really want to make sure that we don't have a lot of town hall meetings with the public and expect that they're going to have time to attend some of those. So I just want to make sure that we remember that that is a pretty significant holiday season, that if we end up having a lot of meetings, people will probably be pretty frustrated with us. So thanks.
Yeah, I think we could probably make a general agreement. I don't know if anyone objects to this, but that we won't hold our town halls until after the turn of the first of the year. So let's commit to that. So early January, and that way we can make sure we aren't rolling over folks' holidays. Is that agreeable or disagreeable to any member?
No, I think that speaks to what my concern is, so thanks.
Yeah, but I don't believe we should postpone or hold off any committee meetings and can get those scheduled. So Mandy, the direction is let's schedule the alternating Thursdays that the CEDC is not meeting, but not start at 9, start at 9:30 because of school. And let's get those programmed out all the way through, if we can, February 1st.
Mr. Chairman, this is Mr. Wheeler.
Yep, please.
I took a look at the calendar, and the alternating days currently would land on the 11th and 25th, which I've noted here as holidays. So I think the Community and Economic Development Committee meeting is on the 4th.
Yep.
And on the 18th. So
we don't want to meet on Christmas?
Well, I don't know about Christmas, but I think Veterans Day and Thanksgiving might be problematic.
So, okay, Mandy, then if you will draft out just the preliminary calendar for us, we'll circulate it to the members and come up with the plan for those days as well.
Yes, sir.
What we did with the meeting today is we met on Wednesday because there were issues of Thursday, so we'll flex as close as we can. But I think that the target is to set out a calendar that people can put in their calendars and rely on. So thank you, Mandy. So next we have on the agenda communications. Dennis, is that you again?
I think, Mr. Chairman, when we discussed this, we were going to open up for a general discussion about how to approach it. So I don't have a written presentation on this issue.
Okay, very good. So then this is an open conversation for members of the Assembly to have a discussion about how we intend to communicate, which can in fact be part of the, one part of it can be the town halls, these committee meetings. And so does anyone have any input they'd like to put on the table for conversation about communications?
Mr. Chairman, this is Mr. Wheeler again. Sorry. I was just thinking I should mention that part of our contract is to provide some website support. So certainly part of the communication plan is to make sure the committee website and any other locations within the MOA pages are properly populated with the information we want to put out to the public. So we'll help with that.
Great. So we have staff support and contract support to do websites, so that's part of it. Other members? Anybody? Need more coffee?
Well, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Pete.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So do we need to create a Facebook page or have a presence on social media? Just throwing that out there. Thanks.
Okay, it's on the list. Questions we'll go over. We have a website, social media, Facebook. Other ideas?
Mr. Chair.
Yep.
We always have the opportunity at the beginning of every regular assembly meeting to do committee reports. So I'm assuming that that will be your responsibility also. Yeah. So there is that, and it will go on public record. So thanks.
Excellent. That's on the list now. Try to be strategic about all of this. Other members? I see Barbara Jones, hand up, please, Barbara.
Hi, Mr. Chair, thank you. I would like to make sure that the communications does involve a communication plan that includes perhaps outreach to community groups, the Federation of Community Councils, possibly other Rotary and other groups, to make sure that the discussion of the reapportionment is very broad. Thank you.
Thank you for getting that on the table. Any other
Mr.
members?
Chair? Oh,
Yes, Ms. Kennedy.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, thank you. And I just wanted to note that in the chat, our legislative liaison, Claire Ross, mentioned that she could also help with any kind of communication. So she may have some ideas, and we ought to be able to use her as a resource as well. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And Claire, I think what's going to happen is we'll take this committee feedback, and then I'm going to come bend your ear on how to draft a plan, and then we will get to implementing it. So thank you for putting your name out there. Other members have any input? So far, we have a website, some social media, assembly reports, direct outreach to community groups, including community councils, Rotary, etc. Probably I will add some media engagement, kind of earned media.
Mr. Chair.
Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you. I just kind of a question, I guess. To what extent would the assembly or even RDI have to basically have a role in maybe doing actual presentations? Because if we mentioned outreach to Rotary, does that mean we're going to offer that we'll do a 20-minute presentation to Rotary Club? Or anyway, so I'm just kind of curious as to what that actually looks like and to what extent we're going to make ourselves available for that kind of outreach. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And when I think about presentations to Rotary or community councils, I do think of a brief kind of presentation developed by the committee that any number of us could deliver, you know, as members of the committee. And so I would imagine, yes, we come up with a framework and then each member can do what they want with it. But we'll try to coordinate these meetings so that we're not doubling up and we get kind of market penetration, if you will, get a message out as broadly as we can. So yes, I would look to have some materials. I don't know that we would have RDI going out doing road shows, but that could be something we talk about, but for sure they can be developing maps and other materials for us to be able to carry with us.
Okay, thank you.
And yeah, RDI would be in a supporting role in those initiatives, is how I imagine it. But again, that'll come back to setting up a plan with Claire and then getting the committee's buy-in for the plan. So any other items to add to that list? I'm not seeing or hearing any. The table on this discussion remains open for a number of weeks, probably, as Claire and I take this information and start to prepare it. So then there's two other items, I guess, that we really need to address. One is going to be, when is our next meeting? And do we know if there's a CEDC meeting? Oh, so as Dennis was saying, the next meeting is Veterans Day, right? The 11th. And so do we want to flex and meet on the 10th again? Any objection to that?
Sounds good to me.
I'd appreciate it if we could meet before the 11th too, Chair.
Okay, so then the plan currently is to, thank you, Ms. Aller, to be meeting on November 10th with agenda items currently a discussion of the Voting Rights Act and potential for legal challenges and other items that may come up as we begin the process working closely with the contractor. You know, we just had them on board this week, really, and so we're late last week. So then there's one other item that's not on the agenda, but I want to make sure we have on the record and discuss. The appropriation item. Oh, Mr. Wheeler, go ahead first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just going to note on the 10th, of course, we're also expecting the state plan to come out. Would the committee be interested in holding their meeting later in the day in the off chance that we might have the state plan to at least talk about, although we may not have any sort of in-depth analysis at that point?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Is any objection to having a later in the day meeting on a Wednesday? So Dennis, one other item we might want to add to the agenda then is a draft of a resolution declaring malapportionment.
We will have that prepared for you.
So that gets to the real meat of the question. So then the meeting starts to become a little richer of conversation, I'm sure. And so, okay, then is there any objection? Let's say 2 o'clock. Is there anything on the calendar that day?
Yes, Mr. Chair, there is. The Rules Committee meeting is from 1 until 3 that day.
So could we do 3 o'clock then? Barbara, is there any conflict there?
I don't see any conflict right now.
Okay, so tentatively, we'll set this for 3 p.m. on the 10th with the intent to see the state's final plan and a draft resolution declaring malapportionment, a discussion of legal issues, including Voting Rights Act, the legal challenges in the past and potential for the future, the timelines, etc. Anything else folks want to add to that discussion at this time? Again, the table remains open for that, and communications plan, we'll leave that on as well. So actually, Mandy, would you move timelines and communication plan into unfinished business for the next agenda? And then new business will be state plan, draft resolution, legal discussion. Okay, if there's no other input, then I would like to turn to the next item on the agenda, which is audience participation. Anyone from the public wish to be heard?
If you're on the phone, you can hit *6 to unmute yourself if you'd like to speak. There's 2 members. One number ends in 4808. And one is 6284. *6 if you'd like to speak.
Okay, I'm not hearing from anyone yet, but I do see Mr. Gates in the queue, and then so we can come back to that question briefly. Mr. Gates.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chair. So I was looking for the appeal of a reapportionment ordinance, and that 30-day appeal period you referred to. And well, I guess my short answer is 30 days would be default for appeal of an administrative decision. And I think that might be a basis somebody who wants to challenge an ordinance that approved a reapportionment map would try to use to pursue that. So in theory, and I can't say definitely, in theory, I think that 30 days might apply. And I think that's sort of maybe a safer bet to err on the side of having a right to appeal. And I just wanted to qualify that by saying that I looked into our state statutes. Well, our charter doesn't provide for an appeal, and our charter is all we have to go by, as we saw in the presentation. We have ordinance that implements the charter in section of our municipal code 225, but it just has the assembly districts named and the map. It doesn't have a process or an appeal, like you mentioned. But we do have a state statute in 2920-60 through 2920-120 relates to reapportionment, or actually the initial apportionment to reapportionment and so forth. But most of those provisions have an exception that they do not apply to a unified municipality, except for 2920-60. So 2920-70 through 120, they don't apply to a unified municipality, which we are. And in there, they have provisions that talk about the reapportionment plan. And if the assembly doesn't get the job done, the voters don't approve one within the time frame, that the commissioner with the state will step in and do a reapportionment. And then that's appealable to the court, or actually the assembly's reapportionment plan would be appealable to the commissioner within 20 days after it's finalized, either by the voters or if it's by the assembly making a decision. We don't need to reapportion, we're not malapportioned. Those can be appealed within 20 days. And then from the commissioner or the city's adoption of a final apportionment plan can be appealed to court. And interestingly enough, it doesn't say how long it can be appealed to a court, but we do have our general court rules that put 30 days as the time limit for an administrative appeal from a final agency decision, which would be the commissioner's decision. So that's where I kind of feel safe to say the 30-day limit is most likely to apply, if it does apply. And sorry for the long-winded answer. It wasn't really obvious or out here, especially since we don't have the direct applicability of a specific time period to a unified municipality.
So, Dean, do you think that's kind of as much as you care to summarize on this, or is this something we should put on the agenda for further discussion for next meeting?
It's probably something we should try to touch on. I don't know about next time, but in the future, I probably would like to confer with Jessica and legal, who's also working with us, and just make sure we have, agreement on that response.
That sounds great. So, Mandy, then let's not schedule it for discussion at the next meeting, but put it on the dashboard for sometime in late November, early December. Okay, anyhow, let's move then back to the question. Is there anyone member of the public wish to be heard? Now's your chance. I'm not hearing from anybody, so I'm going to assume the answer is no. We have a date for our next meeting. We have a draft agenda for our next meeting. Is there any last things members of the committee would like to say before we adjourn? Or members of the assembly? Or anyone else? Hearing and seeing none, this committee meeting is now adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.